So welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now I'm Philip Ingram, I currently present Times Radio Frontline. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer who's got an opinion on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, cyber and anything else people ask me to comment on. But I've got some fantastic videos for you this week, and before I get into these ones, I do urge you to go to our channel and watch all of them. We've had some amazing interviews, and if you can't get us on YouTube, go to your favourite podcast channel. You can get us on there, just search for Times Radio Frontline. But before we start on the interviews that have been done this week, two clips that have influenced it. The first one is Donald Trump on Air Force One, and he was asked a question by a member of the press corps. Let's watch this.
Mr. President, yesterday you mentioned that you would change the Russia deadline to 10 to 12 days. Has that started yet, or when can we, see the official statement that is the new deadline?
I'll tell you what, I'll give it to you now. Do you want a big scoop?
Yes, please.
Everybody else, close your ears, okay? You ready?
I'm ready.
10 days from today. And then, we're going to put on tariffs and stuff, and I don't know if it's going to affect Russia, because he wants to obviously probably keep the war going. But we're going to put on tariffs and the various things that you put on. It may or may not affect them, but it could.
And he was asked a direct question, when does the 10 days start? Having reduced the threat of secondary sanctions against those that are doing business with Russia from 50 days to 10 days. 50 days took us to the 2nd of September, whenever he first made that announcement. 10 days takes us to the 8th of August, because he was very clear as to when it started. It started now. What the effect is going to be, Donald Trump has said he doesn't know, but I think we'll see that the Indians and potentially the Chinese may be concerned privately. The Chinese have come out and said that they will not be influenced by these sorts of tactics from Donald Trump. So we'll find out next week and see how it goes. The second clip is from a Russian spokesperson talking about the sanctions and how Russia's going to approach it. And they turn around and say, hey, the Americans have put so many sanctions on us. This is just another set. We don't ignore them completely. We'll have a little look at it, but we're not really bothered about it. Let's have a look at this.
Против России, против наших международных партнеров уже объявлено такое беспрецедентное количество санкций, всевозможных других ограничений нелегитимных, что, по большому счету, угроза новых рестрикций стали просто какой-то рутиной. Это совершенно не значит, что мы на них не реагируем. Нет, реагируем, безусловно, разноформатно, по-разному, обсуждаем их и так далее. Но, понимаете, уже стало понятно, что это на этой ноте Запад заело. Полностью сбрасывать их со счетов, как вы понимаете, не позволяют издержки современного мирового хозяйственного устройства, но мы знаем, как этим санкциям противостоять. Мы видим, что от темы санкций Запад просто отклеиться не может. Вот такое впечатление, что буксуют постоянно. Видимо, других вариантов уже не осталось, истребили. При этом мы реагируем и предпринимаем меры для того, чтобы всему этому противостоять или оборачивать это даже в собственных интересах, использовать это. То, что, конечно, удар наносится по мировой экономике, сомнений нет. То, что эти санкции уже буквально подорвали благополучие целых регионов мира, это тоже понятно. Странно, что это понятно одним и непонятно другим.
Hoping your Russian is as good as mine, but it's quite clear, the Russians are just coming out with the standard Russian rhetoric. I don't think they're going to listen to the threats that are coming out of Donald Trump. Maybe if there is a proper impact against the likes of China and India, them going back to Vladimir Putin and potentially suggesting that it's not worth their while doing the business they are might have some form of economic impact. But until that happens, and there's a big if around this, we just don't know. So I think people are just going to wait and see. And that includes Russia, and that includes the International Press Corps, who were accompanying Donald Trump on Air Force One. So the two interviews that I want to point you at this week are one that I did with Sean Bell. Sean is a former RAF Harrier pilot and an Air Vice Marshal. And actually, we drilled this week into air power and getting an understanding from a tactical perspective why the Russians' air power didn't work, why what's wrong with the way the Russians are approaching they're dealing with air, how the game has changed now that drones are taking over, and the debate that we both have is fascinating. Sean describes how the Russians don't have a separate air force, they're more like being part of the army, the way they don't know how to work together, the way they are suffering reliability problems, and the fact that they've had to move their aircraft or their serviceable aircraft out to distances far away from the Ukrainian borders, and then the Ukrainians managed to attack those serviceable aircraft. And he talks about the fact that they don't really have an airborne command and control capability, because again, the Ukrainians have attacked the A-50 AWACS type aircraft that the Russians operate, and that impacts their ability to be able to coordinate attacks on the front line. And then we have a bit of a debate and understanding about the new weapon systems and the glide bombs that are being used by the Russian aircraft and the impact that those have. This is a good interview. This is taking a different angle to we have done with some of our more politically focused interviews. I can't commend it more highly.
Russia traditionally misidentifies equipment as capability.
Yeah.
If you look at the Russian Air Force, it's got some pretty impressive aircraft. But unless you do, we used to call it PAN-DLOD, Defence Lines of Development. It's not just about the equipment. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Scratching my head a bit. But it was lots of things like, was it tepid oil, training, equipment, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. Unless you invest in them all, that equipment you can't turn into capability. And the Russians have singularly failed to be able to turn what should be dominance in the equipment, to be able to create an air umbrella over the front line and make life utterly untenable for the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, Russia's lost quite a lot of aircraft. It hasn't synchronized its efforts well, and it's almost licking its wounds, and it's allowing the Ukrainians to actually take the fight to them. I mean, most recently, was it the Spider's Web strike?
Fascinating.
I mean, just look at that. You think Russia moved all its heavy bombers away outside drone range, thinking they were safe. Next thing, probably a year or two in the planning, out of a box, a whole load of drones fly out, land on the wings, blow up, a whole load of bears, backfires and mainstays, 2 bombers and 1 intelligence aircraft. And although we counted the numbers, and of course we went, it's a significant proportion of the bomber fleet, it was far worse than that for the Russians, because they had only flown the aircraft away that were serviceable. As you well know, Russia's famous for cannibalizing its aircraft. So the proportion of their fleet that was actually flown away, that was serviceable, was most of them, and a good number of those were taken out. We've already seen, even in this country, fewer efforts by Russia and its air force to penetrate UK airspace, largely because they're hurting.
Well, we'll not talk about different air forces that cannibalise their aircraft to keep others going, because that would be a different discussion. But you mentioned the long-range bombers and the importance of long-range bombers, and a historic role of air power has always been the ability to strike with precision, deep strike behind enemy lines. But now we're seeing again, the Russians are using deep strike, but randomly against civilian population and everything else. The Ukrainians are being much more surgical with their very long-range drones, and not just Operation Spider's Web, but they're actually flying drones from Ukraine thousands of kilometres to hit critical military infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, factories, oil refineries, and all the rest of it. Is this changing the thinking behind how we provide that deep strike capability in the future? Or are we just harping back to what happened effectively during the Second World War with the V1 and V2s?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. I'll come at the specifics of that. But if you look at what Ukraine's trying to do, why is it striking inside Russia? Is that actually going to change the course of the war? Are they actually materially stopping Russia supporting the war effort? The answer to that is no. What they're trying to do is make sure the Russian population recognise they are in a war. And also, they've been very effective at targeting the oil infrastructure for Russia, because, of course, that's how they finance the war, and the more you can take that out. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that whilst we in the West have some pretty healthy technology around drones, the actual drone itself is an engine, it's a fuel tank and wings and a bit of a sensor. But that makes it sound, it's easy to build it. The difficulty is flight testing, assurance and all that. That takes years. The beauty with Ukraine is you can send a box of bits to Ukraine that hasn't ever been flight tested, doesn't come with a warranty. Ukraine goes, we're at war. We don't care. They bolt it together and send it flying. And they've been very effective at causing a little bit of carnage in Russia. I think it feels a little bit like, though, you're on a picnic and the wasps are irritating you. They're not going to stop your picnic. They're just a bit of an irritation. And that's what President Zelensky and the drones have done for the long-distance drones. I do think we've, going back to your major point, though, is this a rethink? I think the danger is we look at one war. You and I have been part of the military and we focus everything on that. If I can just give one example of the opposite side of that, Israel and Iran, they don't share a land border. And Israel mounted a very, very clever attack against Iran, 24 hours, rolled back their air defences, and now operated over Iran, over Tehran, with impunity with their modern fighter jets, causing carnage, surgical strike and the like. And if you were to look at our country, do we have a land border with someone like Russia? No. We have a moat. No, I know it's a little bit bigger than a moat, but effectively we have a moat. And therefore, the analogy for us is more, we can use air power for surgical strike at distance, at pace. The one thing the drones don't do is they don't hit targets very quickly. And as you and I both know, your intelligence, sharp intelligence, it's fleeting. You need to be able to strike it pretty quickly. Drones can't do that. They take a long time to get to their target.
And then, of course, the next interview I want to point you at is another one that I did this week, and this is with Professor Scott Lucas. Scott understands the geopolitical position of what's going on intimately. And we try and drill into the change in Donald Trump's stance and his understanding of how that might impact what's going on, but drill into the effects that things are having in the Russian public and the impact that that'll have on the Russian front line. His analysis always gives you additional little nuggets to think about. And you know, I look at this all the time and love chatting to him because he gives me things to go away and go, that's something that I need to consider again. Again, I can't recommend that interview more highly.
We're back to the question of, do we have a unified international community behind Ukraine in the resistance against the Russians? I'd say probably, I'll put down a few markers what I'm looking for. One is the Russians really, really need a propaganda victory on the Eastern Front. They're taking individual villages, but they've had a bit of a setback. If those people who are really watching this carefully, up in Sumy, which is the border region in the Northeast, this was really important because the Russians were trying not only to put pressure on 4 Ukrainian regions, they wanted to add 2 more, Sumy and Kharkiv. And they were trying to, they would call it a buffer zone, but to take territory in Sumy, Ukrainians are actually regaining some of that territory. Zelensky mentioned it a couple of days ago. So what Russia needs is Russia needs to try to take this logistics hub or former logistics hub, because the place has been leveled, of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. You know, it's not enough just to take villages. They need another town to tell their people huge success. And they could get Pokrovsk, but I tell you what, it's now over a year since they started that assault.
Oh, it's another Bakhmut.
Exactly. It's another Bakhmut. So it's not like the Russians are making huge gains. And meanwhile, a story to watch, because I don't think it's just spin, is that the Kiev School of Economics did a survey, which has just come out, which is that the Russians are now back. They've depleted their Soviet era equipment, and their level of supply from Russia to the front lines is now back to pre-2022 levels. Now, you have to be careful about that because, of course, there's new forms of warfare, such as drones, which kind of has to be configured in here. But if the Russians are facing resource strains, that's a story to play with. Economically, you and I have talked about the sanctions and the Russian constraints. Then, on the other hand, what I think you have to look at in terms of Ukraine is that the EU continues to keep its act together. So I'll add one more thing that is massive here that's come out, because I don't think the media has quite clocked this as well. I've been doing interviews on the other front of Trump's tariff chaos, yada, yada, yada. For all the downside of that lose-lose framework with the EU, because no one wins in a tariff exchange, there are 2 provisions in that tariff that are important for Ukraine. And I have to hand it to the EU. And you and I have both been critics of the EU in the past.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily operate the most effectively. But man, they played a bad hand brilliantly here. The first thing they said to Trump is, we're going to invest in your defense industry.
Yeah.
And that's $600 billion. Now, it may not be $600 billion, but what they've actually done is they've actually told the Americans, we're going to buy your military equipment.
Yeah. Because
it's part of the EU expansion of defense production and defense investment, some of which will go to Ukraine, right? So now they're locking in not only the Patriots, but other forms of U.S. equipment because Trump sees it as a business deal, right?
Yes.
Secondly, $750 billion of American energy products.
Yeah.
Now, it may not be $750 billion, but the EU put a figure of $250 billion per year for 3 years.
Yeah.
Now, American liquefied natural gas, American oil, American nuclear fuel. Now, why are they doing that? Well, the EU is committed to cutting all supplies of Russian oil by 2027. Certain countries like Hungary, Slovakia say, oh, don't know about that. We like our Russian energy supplies. Now the EU is going to be able to go to those folks and some others in the bloc and say, look, we've got supply that's been issued from the United States. It's the frustrating thing for all analysts, and you and I know this, is marathon, not a sprint. We'll repeat it again.
Yeah.
But apart from the Ukraine, that flutter in Ukraine, and that's actually, I shouldn't say flutter, apart from that serious issue that flared in Ukraine, it's been that example of that if you get beyond the headlines and the chatter, Ukraine's not only resisting,
but it's winning.
I'd be careful with winning, Philip. I'd be careful. Now, you and I'll just slightly disagree with that. What I'd say with it, Ukraine is punching back.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I'd say with this, and why I'm careful with winning, Philip, and I value everything you say on that, is at the end of the day, it's not a winning which is going to be in the case of a military victory over Russia.
Oh, exactly.
Exactly. But in the ability to have withstood what is the most serious assault on European soil, I think probably we would say since 45.
Yeah.
Now, as a smaller country, to maintain the large part of your nation and to do it as a democracy in which most of the nation is invested, that even if they're critical of Zelensky, and many of them have been, they believe in Ukraine.
So thank you for watching the recap this week. Go and watch all our videos or listen to them on your podcast channel. I'm Philip Ingram. Thank you. Goodbye.